Hi, my name is Hannah Peterson. I will be presenting a project on FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our 32nd president. When people think of a powerful figure in history, they usually don't think of this person as having a disability. However, you may be surprised to know that many of our previous presidents had disabilities. Some of these were Jefferson, who had a stuttering issue, and many of our presidents had dyslexia, including but not limited to JFK, Jefferson, and Washington. Clinton and Reagan both wore hearing aids. Reagan was also extremely nearsighted. Teddy Roosevelt was blind in one eye and had severe asthma. Madison had epilepsy, and Lincoln had Marfan syndrome and suffered from severe depression. But perhaps the most commonly known president to have a disability was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Knowing that all these powerful people had disabilities and were able to overcome them to lead this country should tell you something about people with disabilities. They are determined, resilient, and nothing can stop them when they are supported by their families and communities. I will talk about FDR's life, and I will give an analysis of the issues surrounding his presidency from a contemporary view as well as a point of view from today. FDR was born in the USA in 1882. He graduated from Harvard in 1903. He married his wife Eleanor in 1905. They had 6 children. He took a position in the New York Senate in 1910. In 1921, when he was vacationing in Canada with his family, he contracted polio at the age of 39. He was sailing when suddenly he fell overboard, and over the next couple days he complained that his back was hurting badly and that his legs were getting weaker. By the 3rd day, he could not stand. Eventually, he was paralyzed from the waist down, and after he was diagnosed with polio, he decided to retire from the political life to go through rehab. He began swimming daily and working out constantly. In 1922, he was fitted for braces, and he needed them for the rest of his life because he could not stand without assistance. When people told FDR that someone had been cured of polio at Warm Water Springs in Georgia, he went there and tried it out for himself. It did not work, but he continued to go there many times a year. In 1926, he bought the property for $200,000 and turned it into a rehabilitation center for polio patients. Eventually, the Warm Springs Foundation was founded, and the property was turned into a permanent hydrotherapeutic center. This is when he decided to return to politics. His wife and a few others encouraged him to do so, although his mother opposed it because she thought he was too fragile. His first public appearance after his diagnosis was in 1924 at the Democratic Convention. He became the governor of New York in 1928, and he stayed in the position for 2 terms. He ran for presidency in 1932, and he stayed in the office for 4 terms from 1933 to 1945, more than any other president in our history. In 1934, he held the first annual birthday ball, and he asked people to donate money in his honor that would go to the rehabilitation center. That night, he raised over $1 million, and he continued this tradition throughout his presidency. In 1938, he started the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, which later became the March of Dimes. The March of Dimes eventually funded the research for Salk's polio vaccine research. Unfortunately, he did not live to see that. He led our country through the Great Depression into the end of World War II. In 1941, he declared war, but he died shortly before the conclusion of the war. In 1943, FDR's health began to go downhill. He felt like he had the flu constantly, and he was still sick in 1944. He was said to be afflicted by hypertension, acute bronchitis, and heart issues. He usually always stood at the podium when speaking. During his last public speech, he was sitting in his wheelchair. On April 12, 1945, while at his rehabilitation center, he had a massive stroke and he died that same day. There was many disability-related issues surrounding his election campaign and during his 4 terms as a president. One of the issues was the way that people were afraid the public would receive him as a person with a disability running for the presidency. His wife and children had a hard time accepting his disability at first, but they eventually became comfortable and liked to help take care of him. Since his family reacted this way, people close to him were worried about how the public would perceive him with a severe physical disability. There was also many rumors going around about where he had been and what had happened to him. He sometimes found it hard to stay strong and confident in the beginning. On top of that, at this time, there was an issue with people using extremely offensive and degrading language towards people with disabilities, and in fact, it was very commonplace. His advisors were worried about what names people would call him in front of him and behind his back. One of the most frequently used terms at this time was cripple. Despite how everyone felt about FDR returning and their fear for how he would be received, he got a good reception from the public. Another issue at this time was that most buildings were not wheelchair accessible, and most people were not even thinking about this as a social issue at the time. He was able to avoid this issue for the most part because he didn't want to use a regular wheelchair, which he said were bulky and he thought they were a nuisance. He designed his own wheelchair from a dining room table, which he took the legs off and replaced with wheels. This allowed him to get around much easier in this world, and otherwise it would have been much harder for him. However, for the average person at this time with a disability, it would have been extremely hard, and it would have been a daily struggle to try to get access to the majority of the buildings of this time. Some of the issues that I mentioned were more extreme back then than they are now, because in the 1920s, disabilities were frowned upon. People with disabilities were treated with just an unbelievable amount of ignorance, prejudice, and worst of all, they were often subjected to inhumane treatment on a daily basis. They were lucky if they got to stay with their families because most of them were shipped off to asylums and banished from their families. They were looked at as unemployable and they were removed from society. The views towards people with disabilities at this time make it even more unbelievable that FDR was able to overcome this negative perception of people with disabilities and become the president. However, it also must be mentioned that he did a lot of maneuvering to minimize his disability in the public's eyes. Although he was confident, he was not comfortable being completely open about his disability. He wanted people to see him as capable and not helpless. He never made mention, or on very few instances did he make mention over his 4 terms of his disability in public. He didn't want the public to pity or have sympathy for him. He didn't want people to feel uncomfortable about what they should say or where to look or how to treat him, whether they should pity him or not. He wanted people to be at ease around him. He designed his custom wheelchair for easier access, but he also designed it because people felt more comfortable around it than the typical wheelchair, because it was made out of an everyday item like a dining room chair. Even though the public knew that he was disabled, they had no idea about how badly disabled he was. For example, they did not know that he could not bathe or dress himself. He preferred to be standing or sitting in his wheelchair when in the public eye. He didn't want the public to see him being moved from the car to a seat. And he also developed a method of walking when in public. He would swing his legs forward so it appeared he was walking, and when he stood or walked, he would use a cane in the arm of someone close to him, usually one of his sons. He also asked that no photos would be taken of him while he was walking or being moved to or from the car. His wishes were usually followed, but sometimes they were not. If the Secret Service caught someone not following these rules, they would take their camera and empty it of its film. Because of this request, most of the photos you see of him today are of him standing at a podium or sitting in an open chair. And if they are of him in a wheelchair, the picture is taken from the waist down. We can only hope as knowledge about disabilities continues to grow and perceptions of people with disabilities come to a greater image, that we'll have a better chance of leaving all these issues in the past. We can only hope that this happens sooner than later, and that one day we'll elect a president that represents our disabled community again. During his presidency, he received thousands of letters from disabled people who wanted to talk to him about his disability and receive some words of encouragement from him. When he passed away, people around the world grieved. He was a symbol of strength and perseverance, not just to people with disabilities, but to everyone. He was often referred to as one of the top 3 presidents with George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. In 1995, there was again controversy surrounding him, and the plans to build a memorial for him in Washington, D.C. were put into motion. Another major issue arose. One side of the dispute wanted him to be shown in his wheelchair, and the other did not. The National Organization on Disabilities felt that he's a role model for everyone, and not just people with disabilities, and that it was denying history to not even have one of the 4 statues to be of him in his wheelchair. They say that he was not embarrassed by his disability, and the way he chose to handle it in public was merely a political strategy. They contend that things have changed and it should not be hidden today because it affected so much of who he was. They also say that not portraying him in his wheelchair reinforces the idea that having a disability is shameful and gives a negative connotation to disabilities. Their belief is that it is not just important to the disabled community, but it was fact, and leaving it out is a historical misrepresentation. Finally, they say that it was an injustice to FDR because his perseverance in spite of his disability is a huge part of his legacy, and that his strength is an inspiration to everyone. On the other side of the issue is the Memorial Commission, which one of his grandsons was a member of. They say portraying FDR in his wheelchair would be historically inaccurate and an affront to his history because this is not how he liked to be depicted. They say that they do not want to revise history just to make a social statement for people with disabilities. They believe that showing him in his wheelchair would be betraying his memory just to make a modern-day poster child, these were words of his grandson, for the cause. Finally, they say that they do not want to remember him as an uninspiring, helpless cripple. I was personally shocked by some of the statements that the Memorial Commission chose to use when defending their stance, especially in the 90s. However, from the information I gathered, I believe that now there is one of the statues in Washington, D.C. at his memorial is of him in his wheelchair. And I included a picture of it in my presentation handout. I think that FDR would have wanted his disability to be shown in his memorial because he believed he was a symbol of the potential disabled people had when they were supported by their families and communities. His belief of this is shown in the following statement. I myself have been through this ordeal, and I am a symbol of what can happen when people with disabilities are strongly supported. Although FDR had his critics for issues related and unrelated to disabilities, I think that we can all agree that his election, especially 4 times in a row, as the leader of our country, at a time when there was little understanding or opportunities for people with disabilities, is an amazing feat, and that we should only be so lucky to have such a president again. He accomplished many things during his presidency, including but not limited to creating Social Security, supporting causes for the disabled and people with polio, ending prohibition, starting the New Deal social programs, and environmental and conservational efforts. He is considered to be one of the most important figures in U.S. history and one of the most influential figures in the 20th century. He accomplished all of this with a severe disability at a time when this made you an outcast. Although the public today is less aware of his disability than the people from his time, this does not take away from the fact that he got overwhelming support when he had a severe disability. His election as the President of the United States was one of the most wonderful events in U.S. history. I will leave you with this quote. Men will thank God on their knees 100 years from now that FDR was in the White House. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed my presentation and have a great day.